when the land had no name. Where two rivers refuse to run straight, where the land does not call itself a kingdom, Babylon did not yet exist, but its memory had already begun. Even before the first human lit a fire, even before a child knew to call for its mother, even before a prayer was uttered in the first cold night of humanity, this land was already whispering. And the river, it remembered. Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, like two silk ribbons, meander through the desert, never straight, never hurried. This is where the dream of humanity chose to begin. Not Egypt, too monumental, not Greece, too loud, but a place where the most important things are born from silence. Water, earth, sky, and people. The first people did not arrive with books. They arrived with questions. Why does the river flow? Why does the seed sprout? Why does the moon change its shape? And why does my heart beat? These questions, they may sound simple, but when asked amidst the silent desert and under a yellowing moon, they become the foundation of civilization. The civilization of Babylon did not arrive with the beat of war drums, but with the sound of water receding from the reeds each morning. People built huts from mud, shielded themselves from the sun with reeds, and started fires with rotten wood. They did not say, "We are the people of Babylon," because Babylon had no name yet. But then, on one very ordinary morning, a woman placed her earthen jar by the riverbank. She bent down, scooped up water, and gently watched the current. In that moment, amidst the soft light and the wind playing with her hair, something immortal was formed. Not a temple, not a crown, but the feeling that this place belonged to them. A dream of mud and river water. Before there was Babylon, there was Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, and small towns that lived between the flood seasons. No one remembers the faces of the first people who came to Eridu, but the Sumerians told that there a temple was erected for Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and creation, as if the universe knew to speak from water. They did not build palaces, they did not forge steel, but they created something that had never existed before. Consciousness of life. Civilization is not born from the sword. Civilization begins when one person watches the sunset, then turns to the person beside them and asks, "Will the sun shine as brightly tomorrow as it did today?" That was the beginning of poetry, of history, and also the beginning of a city that had no name, but was already dreaming. Babylon, at that time, was just a small river port, amidst countless canals, dikes, and terraced fields. But what made it different was not its location, but its rhythm. The people who lived here seemed not to build with their hands, but with their hearts. Each brick was not just fired from clay, but mixed with the belief that this would be a place where the gods would walk. And indeed, according to the ancient historians, they believed that the gods themselves walked through the marketplaces, sat on the porches of the elderly, and listened to lullabies in the cold night wind. No one named Babylon at that time, but the nameless is sometimes the greatest. Like a child before it has a name, like a poem before it has words, Babylon was an idea that grew quietly, day by day. The people of this land had begun to write, not to preserve their fame, but to not forget. On sun-baked clay tablets they recorded the amount of grain traded for a jar of oil, the name of a son away from home hunting in the west, the arrangement of the seasons according to the movements of Venus. Nothing glorious, nothing epic. But it was in these ordinary things that Babylon touched immortality. Because when a civilization begins to record the small things, It is declaring that every moment is worth remembering. The Euphrates flowed on, without hurry, without hesitation. It had flowed past countless generations, past the round houses of the Ubaid period, past the first stone temples of the Sumerians, past the small towns that rose and fell. But at a certain bend in the river where the current curved as gently as a slow storyteller, something had sprouted. It was not just land. It was thought. And from that thought, a city would be born. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but the first bricks already had a soul. When the name was uttered in the wind, there is a moment in history that no one recorded, no one described, no one witnessed, but it still happened. The moment when a nameless land, a small river port trading grain, a resting place between two large cities, suddenly realized its own existence. Not through victory, not through a prophet, but with a very soft call, Babylon. No one knows who first uttered that name. Perhaps it was a lost Sumerian merchant, as he wrote on his clay tablet, "Today I will rest at Babylon." Perhaps it was a cowherd, when he told his friend, "That village near the river bend, I call it the Gate of the Gods, where I dreamed of the god Marduk." Perhaps the name appeared because, deep down, everyone felt that this was no ordinary place. And then, like a current that no one could stop, the name remained. Bab-Ilu, the Gate of the Gods, Babylon. Around the year 1894 BCE, amidst the turmoil of the city-states, another name appeared, Sumu-Abum. No epic was written about him. No great statues, no golden temples, no grand conquests, but he did something simple yet profound. He declared Babylon his own. Not a fishing village, not a stopping point, but a kingdom. And with that act, he became the first to wear the crown of Babylon, a crown made of the belief that this place would endure forever. The city of Babylon under Sumu-Abum was nothing like our imagination. No Ishtar Gate, no hanging gardens, no sky-piercing towers or temples of jade. There were only clay walls, clay tablets recording taxes, a small temple dedicated to the god Marduk, and the silent resilience of a people who believed in tomorrow. You can imagine a day in that place. In the morning, a farmer opens a dike to let water into the fields. At noon, a student sits writing cuneiform on a clay tablet in the shade of a tree. In the evening, a mother sings her child to sleep with a lullaby whose words no one remembers, but which always lulled the baby to peace. That was not glory, but breath. And that breath was the very pulse of Babylon. After Sumu-Abum, his successors continued a task that seemed anything but great in the eyes of posterity. They built, one brick at a time, not building to show off, but building to preserve. Babylon was not born in splendor like Thebes or Memphis. It had no prophet, no creation myth. Babylon grew like a wild reed by the river, through persistence, diligence, and an unspoken faith. The names of the kings after Sumu-Abum, Sumu-Lael, Sabium, Apil-Sin are no longer carved in golden letters, but in the cracks of walls, in hastily recorded tax ledgers, in bricks engraved with names as small as a fingernail. The city of Babylon was still just a small center among many powers, but something was different. Here, people did not just cultivate, they thought, they asked questions, they began to look at the sky not just to predict rain, but to find patterns. They looked at the temple of Marduk and did not just offer sacrifices, they began to record the rituals, the festivals, the dreams. That was when the city began to speak, not with its mouth, but with cuneiform, angular, monotonous strokes, yet containing an entire universe within. One such line might only record 3 measures of barley for 1 goat. But hidden within was the recognition that every exchange has meaning. Another line might record, on this day, the first moon of the season, the priest offered fire to Marduk. But it showed that belief had become memory, not just a fleeting emotion. If you stood on the clay roof of a Babylonian citizen in 1800 BCE, you would see a small city, not grand, not crowded, but there was something very durable. The dirt roads were constantly being patched. The rough wooden doors were always closed at night. Children learned to write while still sitting on their mothers' laps. The nightly lullabies mentioned the stars, as if the sky was also a part of the family. Babylon was beginning to understand that a city is not just houses and walls. It is memory, order, emotion, and aspiration. And so, when the winds from the north blew, carrying news of rising empires like Assyria or Elam, Babylon did not tremble. It did not prepare a mighty army. It prepared something else, a foundation, as firm as rock, as soft as earth, and as deep as the human heart. Because it knew its time would come. No need to rush, no need for noise, for things that endure always begin in silence. Long before Hammurabi ascended the throne, Babylon was already dreaming. But now, that dream was beginning to take shape, to have a voice, to have weight. The 19th century BCE was closing with cracks spreading across Mesopotamia. Assyria in the north was rising. Elam from the east was a silent threat. The old city-states like Uruk, Kish, and Larsa constantly changed alliances, rebelled, and then reconciled. In this landscape, Babylon was not a major power, but it had something few others possessed, the quiet composure of clay. It did not demand, it did not show off, it just continued to build. Each generation, another wall. Each harvest season, another ritual. Each drought, another written record. And each soul that passed through left behind a piece of memory. Then one day, as the Euphrates water level dropped, as the sky darkened, signaling a long summer, amidst the clay tablets recording the price of barley and the sun-baked bricks as usual, a new name was heard. Hammurabi. He did not appear as a savior. He was not born in fire, nor was he foretold by the gods in a dream. He grew up amidst marketplaces and clay tablets, in a world where justice was something people had to think about daily, not wait for a day of judgment. And perhaps it was this that made him the right king at the right time. Hammurabi did not come to conquer. He came to organize people, to organize land, to organize belief, and above all, to organize the concept of right and wrong. During his reign, Babylon began to hold its head high, not because of a mighty army, but because its ideas had taken form. A city that knew how to write, a people who knew how to remember, and a king who knew that law was not a sword, but a commitment to the future. Hammurabi would write that on stone, and the stone would never forget. As night fell, and the sound of rustling barley rose from the river, the people of Babylon lay on their rooftops, their eyes turned to the stars. They did not know that they were living in a period that would define an entire civilization. They only knew that. The river still flowed. The children still learned to write. And tomorrow would still come. Babylon was ready, not to rule the world, but to show the world that justice, too, could be carved in stone, just as stars are drawn in the sky. A child born in a land that knew how to remember. In a place where the earth knew how to hold a footstep and the sky knew how to listen to unspoken dreams, a child was born. No one knew that one day he would write justice in stone. Hammurabi. That name would one day echo in libraries, temples, and the sleep of scribes. But when he was young, that name was just a soft call on the Mesopotamian wind, an ordinary name like any other child's, born in an age full of uncertainty, but not lacking in people who knew how to dream. Babylon before Hammurabi, circa 1810–1792 BCE. Around 1810 BCE, the city of Babylon was a small state situated in the midstream region among major powers. To the north was Assyria, militarily strong. To the south were Larsa, Isin, and especially Elam from the land of modern-day Iran, which frequently expanded its influence. To the southwest was Mari, a complex trading center with a diplomatically rich culture. To the east was the Zagros Plateau, home to migrating tribes that often caused instability. Babylon at that time was not large. Its population was less than a few tens of thousands. It had no wall encompassing the entire city. It had no superior political power. But it had something more precious than any army: the silent accumulation of memory. And in that accumulation, Hammurabi was born, possibly around 1810 BCE, according to estimates by many scholars based on the middle chronology commonly used in Mesopotamian archaeology. He was the son of Sin-Muballit, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Babylon, an Amorite lineage, Western people, once considered nomadic, but by this time had gradually integrated into Akkadian and Sumerian culture. Hammurabi growing up, amidst fragile order and looming chaos. There are no detailed records of Hammurabi's childhood, like most kings of that era. But from administrative texts, transaction tablets, and especially documents from his time as king, one can imagine a very clear picture of the world he grew up in. That world was a tangled map of city-states, where alliances and betrayals changed in a single rainy season. It was a place where rivers brought not only silt, but also disputes over irrigation, land, food, and even blood oaths. Hammurabi grew up not in war, but in latent tension. He learned cuneiform, the language of stone. He learned mathematics, to measure land, calculate grain, and divide fairness among households. He learned astronomy, because every star was a sign, and every eclipse could be a good omen or a bad one. But above all, he learned to observe how a teacher argued with a farmer over an unfair canal division, to observe how the temple requested tax exemption for a widow whose son was conscripted, to observe the written records of transactions, where just a small error could cost a family their entire harvest. And from that, Hammurabi began to understand. Order does not arise naturally. It needs to be written down. A world without law, only agreements and force. At the beginning of the 18th century BCE, there was no unified legal code in all of Mesopotamia. Each city-state had its own legal customs, mostly based on tradition, the judgment of priests, or the power of the stronger. In one place, a thief's hand was cut off. In another, they might have to compensate with cattle. Some places judged by the will of the gods, through lots, sacrifices, or oaths. But all were ambiguous, lacking sustainable fairness. Hammurabi grew up amidst that ambiguity. He did not accept ambiguity, not because he wanted a revolution, but because he was a man who loved clarity. And the clearest thing of all was stone. Unlike the wind, unlike paper that can burn, unlike the human mouth that can change its story, the stone remembers, And in the young prince's heart, a grand idea gradually formed. If I cannot make all people equal, then at least I can let everyone know in advance what will happen. Ascending the throne, but not in legendary style. In 1792 BCE, Sinmuballit abdicated, possibly due to illness or pressure from neighboring powers. Hammurabi, then about 18 years old, ascended the throne. There was no grand coronation ceremony, no empires bowing, no deifying epics. Only a modest record. First year, Hammurabi was chosen by the god Marduk to uphold justice in the kingdom. And from that day on, Hammurabi did nothing out of the ordinary. He did not wage war in his first year. He did not expand his territory. He did not build a golden temple. He just observed more, listened more, and began to lay the first bricks for a system of justice that had never existed before. In a corner of the Marduk temple, where light slanted through the cracks in the clay walls, he sat alone, looking at a clay tablet inscribed with a student's handwriting, where a land dispute had dragged on for 3 seasons without a verdict. He closed his eyes, and in that moment he saw a dream. A stone that could speak. A young king among giants. When Hammurabi first ascended the throne, Babylon was just a modest city-state in the political labyrinth of southern Mesopotamia. No one expected much from him. To the south was Larsa, under the rule of Rim-Sin-Ri, a master of alliances and warfare. To the east was Elam, always interfering in Mesopotamian city-states. To the west was Mari, possessing a vast and cunning trade network. To the north was Assyria, though not as powerful as it would later become. Always watched Babylon like someone on a hill looking down. Hammurabi, young, with no large army, no strong fortress, did not choose to react like most other kings. He did not build an army first. He did not conquer. Instead, he built canals. A series of irrigation projects, systems to channel water from the Euphrates, were implemented in the early years of his reign. Because Hammurabi understood one thing: he who controls the water controls life. The battle was not fought on the battlefield, but in the tax records. In the first 10 years of his reign, from about 1792 to 1782 BCE, Hammurabi focused on reorganizing Babylon internally, reforming the tax system, standardizing weights and measures, appointing public officials responsible for supervising harvests, controlling temples to limit excessive religious privileges. These actions did not endear him to everyone, but he did not do it to be liked, but to avoid future chaos. Because he understood, a kingdom does not need bloodshed to collapse. It only needs everyone to live by their own law. Necessary and wise. Battles. By about 1780 BCE, Babylon was strong enough in administration, logistics, and finance to enter a phase of expansion. The campaigns were not simultaneous, but step by step, at the right moment. Larsa was isolated through diplomacy before being ambushed. Mari, once an ally, was destroyed when it betrayed him. Elam was pushed back from the border cities in a swift campaign. Eshnunna, a major center to the east, was annexed after a series of agreements and counterattacks. By 1763 BCE, after 30 years of rule, Hammurabi controlled most of Mesopotamia, from Assyria in the north to Ur in the south. Babylon, once a faint name, was now the center of the known written world. But he did not call himself an emperor. He did not proclaim himself King of Kings. He simply called himself the preserver of justice, the nurturer of the weak. Because he knew well, a sword can cut flesh, but only law can cut injustice. Preparing for something greater than victory, writing the law. After unifying a vast land, Hammurabi did not rest. Instead, he began a task that no one had ever done before: to gather, record, and publish the entire laws of the kingdom on stone. Not to be stored in a library, not for only the nobility to read, but for everyone to see, for everyone to know. A public comprehensive law equal before the stone. As the sun set over Babylon, the aging king could still be seen sitting on his brick porch, his hands turning over clay tablets recording court cases. He was not trying to perfect the law. He just wanted one thing: let not the weak have to guess. Let not justice depend on chance. Let not what is right be forgotten in silence. When justice stepped out of the temple. From ancient times, in the city-states of Sumer or Akkad, law was often seen as the right of the gods or the priestly class. Nothing was written down clearly. Everything had to be asked of the gods, divined, or followed according to oral traditions. Hammurabi was the first to break that order, not to seize power, but to return justice to ordinary people. He began by summoning lawyers, scribes, and judicial officials from all over his territory, from Mari, Sippar, Ur, Eshnuna. They brought with them thousands of clay tablets, recording actual verdicts, cases, and disputes. And then, on that foundation, Hammurabi compiled a single code of laws, applicable to all social classes in every land under the Mesopotamian sun. A stone that could speak. The code was inscribed on a large diorite stele, nearly 2.25 meters high, jet black, not easily broken. It was not just a container for text, it was a symbol. At the top of the stele is an image of Hammurabi facing the god Shamash, the god of justice, light, and truth. Below are more than 280 laws, written in Akkadian cuneiform. Not everyone could read the script, but everyone understood the symbol. Justice is not in the hands of the king. It is in the hands of the stone, and the stone favors no one. The content of the immortal laws. The Code of Hammurabi was not merely a set of dry regulations. It was a mirror of ancient Babylonian society, reflecting all aspects of life. On criminal matters, he who kills another shall be put to death. If a man breaks another man's arm, his arm shall be broken in return. On civil matters, a debtor must repay on time, but during a drought, payment may be postponed. He who builds a house for another and the house collapses, causing death, shall be punished accordingly. On marriage and family, a husband may not divorce his wife if she has committed no fault. A woman has the right to divorce if she is mistreated. On agriculture and commerce, the laws regarding canals, harvests, and land rental were extremely detailed. If a man fails to maintain his dike and causes a flood, he must compensate for all the damage. Not just punishment, but protection for the weak. Orphans, widows, and the poor were to be judged fairly. Slaves also had rights, though limited, and could not be killed without cause. The philosophy behind it: balance, not absolutism. What is impressive is not the severity, but the consistency and transparency. Every action had a clear consequence. No one could say, "I did not know." And when the law was written down, it was no longer the king's law, but the law of the stone. The recurring phrase in the code is, if person A does this, then this will happen to them. If person B is harmed, then they will be compensated in this way. This was the first logical approach to law in human history. And above all, it stemmed from a heart that did not want power to lie in the hands of emotion. Proclamation and legacy for posterity. The code was erected in major cities: Babylon, Sippar, Larsa. The people, even if they could not read the letters, would walk past, bow their heads, and feel safe. Because now they no longer lived in the shadow of injustice. They knew that if they were wronged, they could demand justice, and if they were wrong, they also knew what the punishment was, clearly, without ambiguity. That was the first time in history. Law became the light of day. Not everyone could read the stone, but everyone understood the steles inscribed with the code of Hammurabi were erected in many major cities: Babylon, Sippar, Larsa, Ur. They were not meant to be read, but to be seen. To see that, in the place where one lived, justice had a form. People walked past the stone, perhaps not understanding all the cuneiform, but they understood the symbol. They saw King Hammurabi standing before the god Shamash, the god of the sun and justice, not to command, but to listen. And that alone was enough for the people to bow their heads not out of fear, but out of reassurance. From the stone, justice spread throughout society. The code did not just change how cases were judged, it changed how people thought. A father thought about his children's inheritance rights. A teacher reconsidered how to teach about land disputes. A builder knew that responsibility lay in his own hands. A soldier understood that he was not a tool of the king, but a keeper of order. The code created a common space for the entire society. In that space, not everyone was equal, but everyone knew in advance what was right and what was wrong. And in that knowledge, there was peace. The stone does not choose sides. The stone only reflects the very light that people shine upon it. The court cases, where reason triumphed over emotion. From clay tablets found at Sippar, hundreds of legal cases from Hammurabi's time have been discovered. Many were very mundane. A farmer lost his ox. A boy broke his neighbor's wine jar. A woman sued for divorce after years of neglect. There were no screams, no blood, no drawing of knives in the marketplace. There were only people sitting down, listening, reading the law, and deciding according to what was written on the stone. No one could argue with the stone, and because of that, society became more peaceful. Marduk, the guardian god of the law, in the Babylonian spirit, the god Marduk was not just a creator deity. He was the protector of the order, of the justice carved in stone. When Hammurabi inscribed the code, he did not just sign his name, he inscribed it in the name of Marduk. That meant the law did not belong to a king who would grow old, but to a god who would never leave his temple. Therefore, when a person obeyed the law, they were not just afraid of punishment, they were respecting Marduk. And that made society function on faith, not just on force. When the stone taught people to look at themselves, there were Babylonian children who were born, grew up, and passed away without ever leaving their homeland. But every day they walked past the stone inscribed with the law. And because of that, they grew up with a standard. That honesty is precious. That deception will be dealt with. That someone will protect the weak without needing to be a relative. The stone, silent as it was, became the greatest teacher. Without scolding, without threatening, just standing there, reflecting humanity with the very things humanity had written, a civilization that saw its face in stone. As Hammurabi approached the end of his life, he knew that he would die, like all other kings. He did not build a tomb. He did not erect a great temple for himself. He did not pass on to his son gold or silver. He only left behind the speaking stones. And thousands of years later, those stones still remain, not to display power, but to tell the world that, once upon a time, in a land between two rivers, people dreamed of a society where everyone knew what was fair, and they carved that dream in stone. The final days, no legends, only silence. When Hammurabi entered the final years of his life, around 1750 BCE, he did not fall gravely ill in a palace, did not fall on a battlefield, nor was he overthrown by rebellion. He simply grew old, like everyone else. No epic praised his death with celestial fire or thunder, only silent records on clay tablets. Year 43, King Hammurabi returned to his ancestors. A quiet death, but rich in memory, because he left behind something few kings could, a society that could function even when he was gone. The greatest legacy, belief in what is right. After he died, his son, Samsu-Iluna, ascended the throne. But Samsu-Iluna was not Hammurabi. He had to face many rebellions, regional divisions, and rising powers in the south, like the Sealand dynasty. However, a strange thing happened. Even though the central government began to weaken, even though provinces might rebel, the code of Hammurabi was still applied. Judges still ruled according to Articles 129, 138, 196. New clay tablets still copied the old laws. Temples still erected images of King Hammurabi standing before the god Shamash. Because justice, once it becomes a habit, is hard to erase. From Babylon, spreading to the world, the code of Hammurabi did not stop within Babylonian territory. It spread to Assyria. It was copied in the region of Syria. It influenced the legal texts of the Hittites, the Elamites, the Hurrians. Over 1,000 years later, even the Torah of the Hebrew people reflected some legal structures very similar to Hammurabi's. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Though the approaches were different, the spirit, everyone must know the law in advance to live in fairness, was an undeniable commonality. And then, when Babylon fell to the Hittites around 1595 BCE and was later swallowed by Assyria centuries later, people thought everything had ended. But in 1901, in Susa, modern-day Iran, French archaeologists discovered a black diorite stele over 2 meters high, densely inscribed with cuneiform. They did not know they had just touched a dream carved in stone. Not just history, but a question for today. More than 3,700 years after Hammurabi's death, we still speak of him. Not because he conquered many lands, not because he built many temples, but because he dared to ask a simple question. What is fair? And instead of letting the wind carry that question away, he wrote it down in stone. Hammurabi did not issue truth. He just tried to get a little closer to it. And in that effort, he left the most precious legacy a human can leave, a standard for those who come after to know how to live. In a quiet night in the land of Mesopotamia, the wind still blows through the rubble of bricks. No more kings, no more temples, no more clay tablets. Only a stone, standing there, silently, as if waiting for someone to approach, to place a hand on its cold surface and hear. This is a place where a man once dared to write law for humanity. And if you are still listening, then I am still here. There are deaths that create epics. There are deaths that create silence. The death of Hammurabi around 1750 BCE did not cause a war of succession. There were no power struggles, no collapsing temples. There was only a new king who rose, wore an old crown, and tried to continue a dream that he himself was not sure he fully understood. His name was Samsu-Iluna, the son of Hammurabi, and he was not his father. Inheritance, not an easy thing. When Samsu-Iluna succeeded, the kingdom of Babylon seemed to be at its peak. From Mari in the west to Larsa in the south, from Sippar in the north to the ancient city of Ur, the temple shone brightly, The laws were written, and the stones were still warm. But like a river in the dry season, what remains after the water recedes is not fertile soil, but cracks. Beneath the surface of the Hammurabi Empire, there were things he had not had time to heal. The southern city-states like Uruk, Isin, Nippur, which had been conquered by Babylon, had never forgotten that they were once independent kingdoms. Many places obeyed out of fear, not respect. And above all, the central resources had thinned due to his father's prolonged conquests. Samsu-Iluna ascended the throne, carrying the immense shadow of Hammurabi and a kingdom that was cracking. Rebellions without the sound of drums. Within just a few years of his reign, around 1745-1740 BCE, southern Mesopotamia caught fire in silence. The city of Uruk declared independence, establishing its own king. Isin rebelled, refusing to pay taxes. Farmers in the Euphrates Dike region broke the canals to protest high taxes and levies. No one called this war. But the land was cracking. The wind felt different, and on handwritten clay tablets, people began to use old words again. Hunger, chaos, crop failure. Samsu-Iluna sent troops to suppress them. He was partially successful, but every time he pacified one region, another would rise up, like a man trying to mend a cracked pot with fire. Because he knew well, if my father built an empire with law, then I am trying to hold it with the sword. But there were still the keepers of the light. Amidst the chaos, a strange thing happened. The temples did not close. The schools did not stop teaching cuneiform. The judges still judged according to the code of Hammurabi, even though the king was dead and the law was 10 years old. Because the Babylonians did not live by victory, but by habit, and that habit was built from memory. A scribe still sat in his clay room, writing Article 196 on a new tablet. A priest still lit the fire for Marduk on every full moon. A mother still sang her child to sleep with a lullaby from the previous generation. Do not take what is not yours. The stone will know. Babylon, though cracked, did not break, because it lived in the hearts of its people, not just in the palace. A king not great, but who did not give up. Samsu-Iluna reigned for 38 years, a remarkable number for a successor in crisis. He did not expand the territory. He did not leave behind great temples, but he preserved the soul of the empire, not letting it dissolve into chaos. He issued some additional laws, mostly based on the old code. He continued to build canals, though on a smaller scale. He had some temples rebuilt that were destroyed by rebellions. When he died around 1712 BCE, Babylon was no longer glorious, but it still existed, and in the ancient world, that was a rare thing. After Samsu-Iluna, the dynasty continued with successors like Abi-Ishu, Amiditana, but political power gradually declined. However, the surprising thing is, Babylon did not disappear. It was not destroyed. It just became quieter. And in that silence, thousands of people still lived, learned, wrote, and believed. They did not make epics. They did not build empires. They just dreamed amidst the sand and stone. And it was they, without thrones, without swords, who kept Babylon alive. There are cities that once shone brightly, then disappeared like a sigh. There are temples that once touched the sky, then collapsed in silence. And there are people whose names no one remembers, but whose hands preserved the dream of an entire civilization. After the glory, a continuation without applause. As Babylon gradually lost control of the south, as old allies like Mari or Larsa broke away, and as droughts, wars, and the incursions of the late Amorites finally wore down its borders. People thought it was all over, because Babylon was no longer strong, no longer conquering east and west, no more kings carving law into stone. But in Sippar, Borsippa, Dilbat, Cutha, smaller cities seldom mentioned, the lamps were still lit. Lamps in the schools, in the clay libraries, in rooms that smelled of clay and oil lamps. There, people did not talk about war. They learned to write. A 10-year-old child learned to draw their first straight line with a wooden stylus. A teacher marked a paper with a nod of his head. Clay tablets recorded, "The 3rd day of the month of Marduk. The sky is cloudy. Today, we study law number 8. No manifestos, no monuments, only the steadfast repetition of a culture that refused to fall into oblivion. The scribes, the keepers of time. If there was a profession worthy of being called the keepers of the flame of Babylon, it was the scribe. They were not officials, not priests. They had no power. But they had something more precious, the ability to rewrite memory. They copied the code of Hammurabi, even though 100 years had passed. They copied astronomical texts, noting the appearance of Jupiter and Venus. They rewrote hymns, praising Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, as if the gods were still listening. Some clay tablets were buried under temple floors, some were cracked, burned, but still preserved a few words. If a man builds a dike and the dike breaks, just a few words, a few lines, a few stubborn gestures against forgetfulness. A world that needed no heroes, only people who remembered. There were no great kings during this period, no second Hammurabi, no new towering steles were erected. But it was the very absence of heroes that allowed ordinary people to shine, quietly, day by day. The teacher who taught a child to write law with their first stroke. The woman who went to the market, bargaining with the correct unit of silver. The farmer who divided his land with his brother based on an old judgment, still recorded on a tablet from their father's time. They did not know they were preserving civilization. They just lived as if Babylon was still great. And that very thing made it so that it never truly disappeared. Memory printed in clay, no need for songs. From this time until about 1600 BCE, the old dynasty of Hammurabi entered its final phase. The later kings no longer had power. The Hittites from the north would advance, and Babylon, once again, would collapse in silence. But the clay tablets would not all burn. The lullabies would not cease. New children would again learn cuneiform, and in that hazy dust, the words remained. If a man steals, if a man is unjustly condemned, if a man loses his ox. Such small sentences, yet they resisted the entire silence of the sand. When the city gates opened, and there was no blood around 1595 BCE, a powerful army from the north advanced into Mesopotamia. They were the Hittites, under King Mursili I. They attacked Babylon, not to occupy it, but to steal the statue of the god Marduk, and then withdraw. There was no long battle. No fires raged through the city, just a direct blow to the soul of Babylon, because the statue of the god was gone. The people were stunned, but as soon as the pain subsided, the Kassites appeared. Not with swords, not with persuasion. They walked into the city, took up the legacy that others had left behind, and began one of the strangest things in ancient history, preserving a civilization that was not their own. The Kassites, not brilliant, but deeply rooted. No one knows for sure where the Kassites came from. Perhaps from the Zagros region to the east. They spoke their own language, unlike Sumerian, Akkadian, or Amorite. They had their own gods, like Shukamuna and Shumalia. But when they set foot in Babylon, they did not erase the name of Marduk. They did not change the writing system. They did not demolish temples or burn libraries. They did the opposite. They restored the statue of Marduk. They honored Marduk as the national god. They wrote their own names into the calendar of the Babylonians. And so, a foreign people became the most trusted heirs of the Babylonian civilization, a long dynasty without need for noise. The Kassite dynasty ruled Babylon for over 400 years, from about 1595 to 1155 BCE, the longest in the history of the entire Mesopotamian region. But they were not prominent. No epics, no glorious wars, no new laws as resounding as Hammurabi's, no massive structures like the Hanging Gardens. And for that very reason, they endured. They continued to teach cuneiform. They copied the code of Hammurabi. They maintained the systems of education, religion, and social division. They named their children in the Akkadian language, the language of their predecessors. The Kassites did not try to make their own mark, but lived as if they were part of the old memory. And by doing so, they made Babylon live longer than any empire. When stillness is a form of power, not every dynasty needs victory. Not every king needs glory. The Kassites understood that. True civilization lies not in city walls, but in habits. And habits only need to be maintained, not praised. During the Kassite dynasty, more clay tablets were preserved than ever before. People recorded land transactions, marriages, divorces, lunar cycles, the movements of Jupiter and Venus. There were no names of generals, no names of kings, only the names of the scribes and what they needed to remember to live right. The second rainy day after the festival of Ishtar, I hand over the western field to my younger brother, accompanied by 2 measures of barley and an oath before the god Marduk. A clay tablet like that, if someone found it 3,000 years later, would see nothing great. But in fact, it was the very breath of a civilization that was alive, slow, deep, and as steady as the roots of a tree. Rebirth without need for uprising. When the Kassites ruled, no one called them dreamers. They were practical, good managers, cautious. But in their steady steps through each dynasty, in the steady rhythm of teaching, in the judges sitting under the shade of trees, in the people bargaining with the correct unit of silver in the market, Babylon was not just alive. It was reborn. No one builds an empire from stone and earth. But the Kassites had preserved a soul with clean hands and humble eyes. When the fortress was no longer stone walls, but letters around the middle of the 14th century BCE, Babylon was no longer a powerful empire. The world around it was changing. Egypt, under Akhenaten and Ramses, reached the Mediterranean coast. The Hittites asserted themselves in Anatolia. Syrian city-states, like Ugarit, emerged with new writing systems. But in all that chaos, in the middle of the plain, there was still a place that lay still, learning, writing, and remembering. Its name was Babylon. No more powerful kings, no more victories. But the lamps in the libraries were still lit, and in the darkness of the age, that was the only light bright enough to be called a civilization. The schools, where memory became a profession. Throughout Babylon, from Nippur to Sippar, the scribal schools, where writers were trained, remained open. Children did not learn to become officials. They learned to record memory. They learned the cuneiform alphabet. They learned to copy old laws. They learned Sumerian poetry, Akkadian myths, the songs of Ishtar, the rituals of Marduk. Each student had a small clay tablet, and each day learned only one line. But that line could be all that preserved the soul of Babylon. The teacher did not shout. He just reminded gently, "This is how our ancestors wrote, and if you remember, then Babylon lives." Astronomy. When watching the sky was also protecting the land. The Babylonians did not just look down at the earth, they looked up at the sky. In Sippar, Uruk, and Babylon, astronomers still observed Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn every night, not to find gods, but to preserve order. They recorded the lunar cycles. They calculated the time for sowing based on the appearance of stars. They scheduled festivals, tax seasons, and irrigation periods. No one called for war. No one built new towers. But the universe still operated, and the Babylonians were still the best readers of the universe. When faith was quieter than prayer, the Kassite-era Babylonian temples were not as splendid as before, but the fire still burned. Oil was still offered. The elderly still sang hymns in the morning. Children still learned ancient prayers during the rainy season festival. No one thought they were preserving a heritage. They just lived normally, as if everything would always continue. But it was that very normality, repeated, unchanged, that was the red thread connecting the Babylon of Hammurabi to the Babylon of dust. They may not have known, but they saved history. When the Kassite scholars copied the code of Hammurabi, transcribed Sumerian and Akkadian hymns, when they preserved astronomical tablets, trade records, and notes on flood seasons, they did not know that 3,000 years later, people would dig them up from the earth, and through them, the world would know that. Babylon was not just a city, it was a way of life. A clumsily handwritten clay tablet, a calendar entry noting the new moon, a hymn copied with slanted ink. All of it was light, a light that did not burn away the darkness. It just softened it. Near the end of the 12th century BCE, a threat from the east appeared, the Elamites. They would attack Babylon. They would steal the statue of Marduk. And once again, the city would fall silent. But this time, it lost nothing, because the keepers of the light had fulfilled their duty. They did not save Babylon with weapons, but with copied memories. And when the last light of the Kassites faded, the written pages were still warm. When the enemy didn't need to destroy, just take one thing. In the year 1155 BCE, the Elamites, an eastern power, entered Babylon. No long battle, no siege, no burning of temples. They did only one thing. They took the statue of the god Marduk. No one died. No temple fell. No library burned. There was just a void that could not be filled. Because the soul of Babylon was not in the stone. It was in that statue. A form from ancient times, a symbol of Marduk, god of creation, god of order, of the city, of life. When it was taken, the Babylonians no longer knew who they were. No god, but still people. Usually, after a god is stolen, the people rebel. But in Babylon, people did not burn the city. They did not kill anyone. They did not scream. The people just fell silent. The teacher still went to school. The scribe still opened his clay tablet. The mother still sang her child to sleep with the old hymn, even though the god could no longer hear. And it was in that silence that something greater than an empire took shape. Collective memory. No need for a king, no need for a throne, no need for a god or a temple, just a community of people who decided not to forget the true empire, the empire within the people. From that point on, Babylon was no longer a major power. The last king of the Kassite dynasty was deposed. The city was controlled by new powers like the second dynasty of Eson and later Assyria. Its borders shrank. The statue of Marduk would have to wait nearly a century to be returned. But there was something strange. No one, not even the enemy, dared to erase the name of Babylon. Because Babylon was no longer a territory, it had become a concept. The place where law was once carved in stone. The place where people learned to write to live righteously. The place where people looked up at the stars to understand the earth. The place where, even when the statue of the god disappeared, faith remained. The last breath and the unspoken promise. In the 11th century BCE, Babylon was no longer the center of the region. Other empires rose: Assyria, Elam, and later Persia. But in the hearts of its people, that city never died. People still named their children Bel-Shunu, I belong to the god. They still held the full moon ceremony for Marduk, even without the statue. They still copied the code of Hammurabi on clay tablets, though no one asked them to. And it was these small, repetitive, unheralded actions that preserved the empire, even when the empire was no more. Babylon, during this period, had no victories, no epics, no monuments, but it had teachers of writing in small alleys, recorders of the movements of the stars, storytellers who recounted the tale of a king named Hammurabi. It was an empire that needed no throne, no territory, no conquests. Only one thing: a memory that outlived the sword. When the last lamps flickered out, Babylon, the city that was once the heartbeat of all Mesopotamia, was now just a name echoing faintly in memory. Around the 9th century BCE, it was ruled by Assyria as a minor province. No more local kings, no more grand festivals, no more caravans of pilgrims coming from afar to offer incense to Marduk. Only moss-covered brick walls, dry canals, and the soft wail of the wind through old temple alleys. In the dusty golden twilight, the clay tablets were still there, scattered in abandoned libraries, waiting for a hand to touch them. Babylon was not dead. It was just dreaming a long dream, an empire from the north, and the silence of the South Assyria, with its capital at Nimrud and later Nineveh, had become the dominant empire of the Near East. They used iron and war chariots, recorded their victories in reliefs on palace walls, burned lands that resisted, imposed their religion, demanded tribute, and deported entire populations. And amidst all that sound of steel hooves, Babylon was silent. The people still worshipped Marduk. They still spoke the ancient Akkadian language. They still taught their children to write in cuneiform, even though in Nineveh people wrote in another language. Not out of resistance, but because they knew, if we still remember our name, then Babylon still lives. In the heart of the conqueror, a strange flame still burned. Even the Assyrians, who had burned the temples of other lands, did not dare to completely destroy Babylon. Because deep inside them, there was also fear. Because they knew Babylon was not just a city, it was the soul of this land. Ashurbanipal, the greatest Assyrian king, had the Esagila temple in Babylon rebuilt. He even sent his own son to study at the scribal schools here, to learn the ancient language, astronomy, and mythology. And so, under the rule of the conquerors, the flame of Babylon continued to smolder. Not blazing, but warm. Nabopolassar, a man not born to be king, but chosen by the land around 630 BCE, a minor official in the south, near the ancient land of Sumer, began to build up a force. His name was Nabopolassar, Not a general, not a nobleman, just a Babylonian who had never forgotten who he was. And in an era when Assyria began to fracture from internal strife, he whispered something that had lain dormant for centuries. Babylon can rise again. An oath in the night, amidst the ashes. No one remembers exactly how Nabopolassar did it. It is only known that he did not immediately declare himself king. He went from region to region, from Ur, Uruk, Borsippa, step by step, reviving faith through kindness. He called not with the spear, but with the name of Marduk. The people did not listen to him because he was strong. They listened because he remembered. He remembered the old songs. He remembered the old laws. He remembered how their ancestors called the stars, the water, the earth. And for that very reason, when he entered Babylon, no one stood in his way. No blood was needed, only faith falling like dust on the ancient bricks. Dawn began with a gentle wind. In 626 BCE, Nabopolassar officially declared himself king of Babylon. It was not the beginning of a dynasty, but the return of a soul. Assyria still existed. Other empires were still strong, but in Babylon, people once again beat the festival drums, burned incense in the Esagila temple, taught young children to draw star charts again, and someone, under the roof of an old temple, looked up at the sky and whispered, "The dreamer has returned, and the dream begins again." A king who not only wanted to rule, but wanted to make the world remember. In 605 BCE, after the death of Nabopolassar, his son Nebuchadnezzar II ascended the throne. A man who was not just a warrior, but the last storyteller with bricks and stones. He once wrote, "Babylon is not a city. It is a poem of the gods. I am merely the one holding the pen." And he began to write, not on paper, but on the earth, with gates, with gardens, with towers, with light. The Ishtar Gate, when heaven bowed down. Perhaps no structure represents the dream of Babylon more than the Ishtar Gate. It was a gate of sapphire blue, covered in glazed tiles, dozens of meters high, with over 500 figures of lions, bulls, and the dragon god Mushusu, arranged in a visual procession, as if each creature was rising from the earth to escort the light through. The gate was not just an entrance, it was an overture. Upon entering Babylon, one entered another dimension, a place where the gods still lived in the brick walls, and humans knew their smallness before beauty. The Hanging Gardens, a love letter. Under the Southern Sky legend says that Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon for his wife, a princess from the mountains who missed the forests and the highland air. No one is sure if the gardens truly existed. But one thing is certain. Babylon at that time was the only place in the world that could imagine such a thing. Verdant terraces, water canals brought up from the river by ancient water wheels, the scent of trees and flowers mixed with the smell of earth after rain, a garden that did not grow on the ground, but grew in the sky. If it was a legend, it was the most beautiful legend of the East. If it was real, it was an engineering feat nearly 2,000 years ahead of its time. A city that knew how to tell stories with light under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon became a universe unto itself. The roads were straight, paved with blue-glazed bricks, reflecting the sun like stars. The temples had ceilings gilded with gold, bricks dyed red, and statues inlaid with lapis lazuli. Every ceremony was a performance of light, music, and incense. Foreigners who came here, from Phoenicia, Media, even Egypt, were left speechless. Not because Babylon was stronger, but because it was more beautiful than anything they had ever seen. This is a city not for living in, but for remembering, a Greek once wrote centuries later. Not just built with hands, but with memory. Nebuchadnezzar was also a scholar. He revised the Babylonian calendar, built libraries for astronomers, sent people to copy texts from the time of Hammurabi, from Akkad, from Sumer. He wanted to connect all the dreams, from the oldest cuneiform dream to the stars in tonight's sky, and turn them into a story that could not be forgotten. A story with no end. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, was not the empire that conquered the most land, but it was the only empire that could silence the world. No one dared to attack it. No one dared to mock it. No one dared to rewrite history and leave it out, because Babylon had become a symbol, the brightest star in the sky of civilizations. As night fell, the people of Babylon would often walk on the city walls, look up at the sky, and ask their children, "Do you see that constellation? That is the name of Marduk, and this is his city." The dream of Babylon did not need to be told in words. It was written in brick, drawn in light, sung by water, and breathed by the wind. When the dream became too heavy to carry in 562 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II passed away. The Babylonian Empire reached its zenith, but the most brilliant place is also the most fragile, like a star that flares brightly before it vanishes. His first successors could not maintain that light for long, and then a strange name was heard, Nabonidus. Not a direct descendant, not a warrior, not a man of ceremony. He was a thinker, a dreamer, and a man who quietly left the Asagala temple to gaze at the desert. Nabonidus, the king who worshipped another god. Unlike his predecessors, Nabonidus was not much interested in Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. Instead, he was fascinated by Sin, the moon god of the city of Haran. He built temples to the god Sin. He sent people to excavate ancient cities. He withdrew from Babylon to live in Tama, an oasis in Arabia. Not for conquest, but to reflect. "I seek light not in the city, but in the darkness of memory," Nabonidus once wrote on a scorched clay tablet. The city dreamed, but the people waited. Nabonidus's absence left a void. The people of Babylon did not understand why their king abandoned the Esagila temple, did not attend the sacrificial rites, did not welcome the new year. Faith, festivals, spiritual order, all began to fall like leaves in late autumn. In the temple, incense still burned, but there was no king to offer sacrifices to Marduk. The priests quietly looked at the sky, not knowing who to pray for. Babylon was still beautiful, but like someone who had just woken from a beautiful dream and was no longer sure who they were. Belshazzar, the prince who held the last guard post. When Nabonidus was away, he entrusted the capital to his son, Belshazzar, a young, hot-tempered man not officially called king. He ruled Babylon like a caretaker, creating nothing new, only trying to keep the walls from cracking and the dreams from collapsing. One night, according to the Bible, as Belshazzar held a feast, an invisible hand appeared, writing on the wall, "Mene, mene, tekel uparsin. You have been weighed and found wanting." Whether this is true is unknown. It is only known that from then on, the wind in Babylon began to carry the strange scent of metal. From the east, a silent figure approached. While Babylon whirled in beautiful dreams and festivals, farther away, across the land of Iran, a man was quietly building a new empire. His name was Cyrus, a man of the Achaemenid people. He was not loud, he did not declare war hastily. He just silently subdued region after region, Media, Lydia, Elam. And then his eyes turned to Babylon, not with hatred, but with the gaze of someone who understood the dream, but knew that the dream was old. In the final months, Babylon still held festivals, still lit lamps, still listened to music in the Esagila temple. But something was quietly changing. The streets grew emptier. Fewer clay tablets were written. Children began to hear of a man named Cyrus, as they would hear the name of a distant wind. No one declared the dream was over. There was no bell. It was just that. The light slowly withdrew from the lapis lazuli walls, like the sun sinking behind the desert without a sound. The city that didn't know it was about to become the past. At the end of 539 BCE, while most of the surrounding lands had fallen into Persian hands, Babylon still shone brightly, like a star that believed itself immortal. The priests still prepared for festivals. The craftsmen still inlaid blue tiles, and Belshazzar still held feasts as he did every year, not out of arrogance, but because they had never known they could vanish. Cyrus, the conqueror, by silence. Meanwhile, Cyrus the Great did not attack Babylon directly. He chose to follow the Euphrates River, not with military force, but with knowledge. He had his soldiers dig canals to divert the Euphrates water. When the water level in the Babylonian canal dropped, Persian soldiers walked through the riverbed and into the city. No broken walls, no bloodshed, no need for an assault. Babylon opened its gates to one who did not fight. A night without gunfire. Only the sound of transformation legend says that the night Babylon fell was a quiet night. The guards did not know what was happening. The people were still asleep. And when dawn broke, the Persian flag was flying on the ziggurat tower. Belshazzar was killed. Nabonidus was captured, but was spared by Cyrus and given a gentle exile. There were no public executions, no show of force, only a proclamation, written in cuneiform. The Cyrus cylinder, the final punctuation, mark. The Cyrus cylinder, the famous baked clay cylinder today, was the last kind farewell to Babylon. In it he wrote, "I am Cyrus, king of the kingdoms. Marduk, your god, has chosen me. I am restoring the temples, sending the exiles back to their homes." No one knows if Marduk truly chose him, but that tone was as gentle as a hand placed on an old man's shoulder saying, "It's over. You can sleep now." Babylon, from kingdom to province, then to memory. After Cyrus conquered Babylon, he did not destroy the city. The city still stood, the temples still burned incense, the priests still performed rites. But it was different. No more Babylonian kings calling themselves the beloved of Marduk. No more great Akidu festivals, no more cuneiform tablets full of philosophy, astronomy, and poetry. Babylon became a province, then an administrative region, then a memory. The death of Babylon did not come by the sword. It came by forgetting. It did not explode like Nineveh. It did not sink like Atlantis. It was not burned like Carthage. It just stopped being called by its name. And so, the empire of the stars returned to the stars. Babylon slept quietly, but was never silent. After falling to Cyrus, Babylon still existed, like a body no longer with a soul, but still warm. The successive dynasties, Persian, Seleucid, Parthian, Sassanid, Islamic, passed through it one by one, like people walking through someone else's dream. No one destroyed it, but no one called its name with the voice of old. Babylon began to dissolve into silence. The first to pick up the pieces of Babylon were not conquerors, but writers, mathematicians, and philosophers. Herodotus wrote of its walls so wide that 2 chariots could run side by side. Berossus, a Babylonian priest living in the Hellenistic period, rewrote the creation myth, the ancient kings, and the astronomical calendar. They did not know everything, but they knew that something very great once existed here, and still exists, in the way we count hours, read stars, and write the names of the constellations. The Romans and Arabs, those who didn't know they were repeating Babylon. When the Romans built aqueducts, they reconnected with the dream of Babylonian hydraulics. When the Muslims looked at the sky, they continued the astronomical tables of the cuneiform masters. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, used Mesopotamian knowledge as his foundation. Ptolemy, the Greek astronomer, cited data from ancient Babylonian observations. No one could read cuneiform anymore, but in their intellect, Babylon whispered. When the Europeans dug in the sand and found the names of the stars. In the 19th century, Western archaeological expeditions came to Iraq. They dug up scorched clay tablets, and they found passages like poetry, tablets listing stars, dates, festivals, buildings that were once schools, libraries, observatories. For the first time in 2,000 years, modern people knew that Babylon was not just a biblical legend. It was a system of knowledge, a network of thought and ritual. And the name Babylon was called again, with microscopes, translation machines, and emotional eyes. Babylon is gone, but still lives in language, science, and memory. When you say hour, you are using the base 60 counting system of Babylon. When you look at a star map, you are looking at the constellations Babylon drew. When you write, you are repeating the action of those who carved cuneiform on clay. Babylon is the source code of human civilization, deleted from the machine, but still present in deep memory. Babylon was not destroyed. It was spread thinly throughout the memory of humankind. In your mathematics, in music theory, in poetry, in the philosophy of the soul, law, language, light, and in the dreams of a hanging garden in the sky, a blue-glazed gate, and a god named Marduk, who millions once believed was listening to them. Babylon has slept, but its dream has not. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept. There is an old song, not sung in Babylon, but written there, by those who never thought they would come. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Psalm 137. That verse was not written to be poetry. It was a sigh from a people taken from their homeland, chained and pushed to a land without their hills, without their holy temple, and without their God present, at least not in the way they had once known. They were the Jewish people, and for them, Babylon was not a beautiful place. It was the final trial of the soul, from burnt Jerusalem to the vast walls of Babylon. In 597 BCE, and more brutally in 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar II advanced into Judah. The city of Jerusalem, where the temple built by Solomon stood, was burned. The city walls were broken, the capital fell into foreign hands, and the most painful thing was not the loss of homes, kings, or land. It was the loss of God. Or more precisely, the belief that God was still with them. Babylon, one man's dream, another man's nightmare. While the Akkadian people praised Babylon with blue-glazed light and festivals for the god Marduk, the exiles, passing through the Ishtar Gate, saw only the gate of a prison camp. The ziggurat towers did not look like heaven, but like thorns. The laughing gods in the temples did not comfort them. They only reminded them of how lost they were. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? They asked each other, as their harps were hung on the willow trees by the river. But it was there that a new dream began to form. When everything was taken away, homes, land, king, temple, voice, the only thing left was memory and story. And so, by the Euphrates, they began to write down their story. They wrote of a creator god, a man named Adam, a great flood-surviving ark, an exodus from Egypt, and a covenant, signed not with ink, but with tears and resilience. The Hebrew Bible, or the core of the Old Testament, was formed precisely from the pain in Babylon, what the exiles learned from their conquerors. Strangely enough, despite hating Babylon, they still learned from it. They learned how to record, to systematize, to write in cuneiform. They learned the Babylonian calendar to record their holidays. They absorbed concepts of angels, life after death, and levels of heaven, ideas deeply influenced by Mesopotamian thought. Gradually, they mixed their dream of Zion with the language of their enemy, and from that fusion, a new identity was formed. No longer a nation, but keepers of the word. In Babylon, for the first time, the Jewish people realized they no longer needed a temple to keep their faith. They became the people of the book. They built synagogues. They organized readings of the Holy Scripture. They passed down stories orally to their children. Religion was no longer a ritual at the temple, but a memory told by the light of an oil lamp. And it was this that kept them alive for the next 2,000 years, through dozens of other exiles. While Babylon still lit its lamps on the ziggurats, somewhere along the riverbanks, Jewish men sat looking at the river silently. No longer angry, no longer praying for miracles, just telling their children, "We once had a home, and as long as the word remains, the home remains. When the land is no longer yours, you live in memory." Babylon could take away the temple, take the king, the rituals, even the language and music, but it could not take the most important thing, the story. And from that, identity became something that survived on the storyteller's lips. The mother who told stories in the dark. As night fell by the river Chabar, a Jewish mother held her small child in a mud brick hut and whispered, "Do you know that our ancestor traveled from Ur, through Haran, to Canaan? His name was Abraham, and he believed in one God, not Marduk, not Ishtar, not Ea, but the God of mercy and justice." That child grew up not knowing what Jerusalem was, but he knew where he came from, thanks to the stories. The first synagogues. Where the word survived without a temple, the Jewish people created the first synagogues. No sacrifices, no powerful priests, only a scroll, the light of an oil lamp, and people who remembered. In those places, they read the Torah aloud. They learned to write, to record, and they passed memory from hand to hand, like embers that continue to burn through a long winter. The first teachers, rabbis, the priests no longer had a place to stand, but the rabbi, the teacher, appeared. The rabbi did not just explain the law, but helped people retain their identity in simple things. A kosher meal, a prayer in ancient Hebrew, a lesson for children that everything can be burned, but the letters cannot. Ezekiel, a voice in a foreign land. One of the shining figures of the exile period was the prophet Ezekiel. He was a priest, exiled to Babylon in the first wave. But instead of remaining silent, he became a painter of dreams. In the book of Ezekiel, he tells of a strange vision. A wheel within a wheel, 4 living creatures with the face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. and a chariot of light carrying God, no longer dwelling in the temple of Jerusalem, but moving along the river Chebar. This meant God is not confined anywhere. He goes with his people, even in exile. Religion becomes psychology, and memory becomes a homeland. In Babylon, the Jewish people could not offer sacrifices, but they could repent. No more external forms, only the heart and memory. From here, the concept of internal religion, a religion of conscience and morality, gradually took shape. They were no longer people of the land. They became people of the promise. Babylon thought it had erased a people, but it was in Babylon that this people became an idea that could not be burned, could not be crucified, could not be buried, because it no longer resided in temples or thrones. It resided in bedtime stories, in a child's eyes, and in the dream of one day returning. A night without thunder, without blood, only silence falling like a curtain. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, there was no great battle. No gates burst open, no blood stained the red bricks. There was only a gate that opened in the night. An army that did not carry flames, but carried permission. Permission to believe, to live, to return. An empire collapsed in silence, like a statue cracking from within. The Babylonians bowed their heads. While the Jews looked up for the natives, Babylon had not been Babylon for a long time. No more brilliant kings, no more New Year festivals, no more crowds flocking to the temple of Marduk. When Cyrus arrived, they were almost relieved. Some records indicate that the people of Babylon opened the gates to welcome him. But for the exiled Jews, it was a night of miracles. Not because Babylon fell, but because the door to return to Zion, which seemed forever closed, suddenly opened. One decree, and 1,000 dreams awoke. In 538 BCE, Cyrus issued a decree. All exiled peoples have the right to return to their homelands, rebuild their temples, and worship their gods. These words did not carry a whip, but an unheralded liberation. And so, one of the strangest homecomings in history began. Jerusalem, the city was gone, the dream remained. When the first Jews set foot in their homeland, the city walls had fallen, the holy temple was gone. The city was in ashes, but in their hearts, Zion had never died. Some shed tears for being able to touch the earth. Some did not recognize the old streets. Some did not want to return, having grown more accustomed to living in memory than in reality. An empire fell so that a people could be reborn. The irony, the great irony of history, is this. Babylon thought it was the eternal center, but precisely when it fell, the seeds it had forced into the ground rose up as trees. Cyrus, the Persian, did not know that when he signed the order for their return, he was not just being kind. He reactivated a sacred dream that had slept for nearly 70 years. Babylon did not die in an explosion. It died in the footsteps of those who left. Without tears, without arson, just quietly packing, holding their children's hands, and heading west. We once sat and wept by the rivers of Babylon, but now we will sing a song of return, not because Babylon has weakened, but because our hearts have become strong enough to rise. Rebuilding, not with stone, but with tears. The Jerusalem they returned to was not like the dream of their exile nights. No halo of glory, no brass trumpets of victory, just rubble, cold under the Judean sunset. And where the Temple of Solomon once stood, There was now a rugged patch of ground. But that was precisely the starting point. If we have our memory, we have our homeland, an old rabbi said. The first stones laid with trembling hands. They could not rebuild the temple with mighty hands. They only had the hands of farmers, stonecutters, and former exiles. But their faith was not broken. It was as flexible as a tree root pushing through barren soil. And so, one by one, the stones were laid, not with mortar, but with memory and prayer. They built not just a temple, but a castle of memory. The Jewish people could not forget Babylon. They could not forget the sight of the towering ziggurat. They could not forget the blue-glazed walls. They could not forget the night they were cut off from history. And so, they built the temple with the image of Babylon in their hearts, but not to glorify it, but to transform it. From now on, the tower would no longer be a place for foreign gods, but a place where the words of the Torah would echo. From now on, the sacred fire would not be used to burn offerings, but as a light to guide those returning from the darkness. The Second Temple, a symphony of past and hope. The Second Temple, built around 515 BCE, did not have the splendor of the First Temple. But it contained more. It contained history. It contained endurance. And it contained a people who refused to vanish. No need for gold, no need for pearls. Only the word is needed, and the temple will exist. Babylon still lived, in memory. Though they had left Babylon, Babylon had not left them. In the Aramaic script they used, in the ideas of heavens and life after death, in the way they organized synagogues, and in the spirit that religion is something no one can force if it lives within. Babylon had crushed them, but from that pressure they did not break. They became the diamond known as the people of the book. In the following years, the Second Temple was not just a place. It was an anchor for the soul. It was the place from which the Bible was copied. It was the center for future generations to understand. We were once exiled, but we did not lose our roots. Someone wrote on a stone wall, "Babylon is where I wept. Jerusalem is where I rose." When a civilization collapses, memory becomes the sole survivor. Babylon no longer had processions for the gods. No more kings standing on high platforms reading prophecies on New Year's Day. No more soothsayers reading sheep livers. No more star charts predicting the harvest. But from the ashes of that memory, humanity distilled. The first written words on clay, the ancestor of written thought. The Babylonian astronomical scrolls, unlocking time and the universe. The oaths in commerce and administration, the foundation of modern law. And above all, the concept of faith surviving without a physical place. The legacy of Babylon in Western religious thought. You can walk into a Jewish synagogue in New York, an Orthodox church in Moscow, a Protestant church on the Nordic plains, or an Islamic lecture hall in North Africa, and see traces of Babylon, in the form of prayer directed towards a sacred place, in the symbol of the Sabbath, ceasing work to remember the sacred, in the concept of the Bible as a holy anthology, compiled, protected, orally transmitted, and handwritten. Every time someone hand copies a Torah scroll, a piece of Babylon lives on, through ink, paper, and memory. The ideas of diaspora and spiritual homeland. There is one thing Babylon taught humanity that it never intended to. A homeland is not just where we are born. It is also the place in our hearts to which we return. Since the exile, the concept of a spiritual homeland has spread. People whose land is occupied can still retain their identity. Migrants can still carry their collective soul. The homeless can still have a home if their memory remains intact. From exile to a mindset of mobility, the foundation for global civilization. Forced exile is a tragedy, but over time, humans learned how to move on their own. The Jewish people after the exile became merchants, scholars, doctors, philosophers. They opened schools, libraries, and closed but thriving communities everywhere. They learned to exist without occupying land, only needing to preserve their identity. Today, when a person leaves their homeland, they are not exiles. But the spirit of exile remains in the thought. Where you go is not as important as what you bring with you. If you ask, where does Babylon still live? The answer is not in the rubble heaps of Iraq, not in the Western museums displaying the Ishtar Gate, but it is in every book people write to not forget, every child who learns their mother tongue despite living far from home, every time a people rises after genocide, war, exile, and says, we are still here. Babylon did not realize that when it conquered, it also sowed seeds it would not have time to reap. And now, all of humanity is the field where those seeds silently bloom. The songs of dust. The gods who never left before. There was a city before bricks were stacked into walls, even before names like Hammurabi or Nebuchadnezzar appeared. There were very soft songs rising from the dust. The songs of the first people who looked at the night sky over the plain between two rivers and asked a simple question. Who made this? The ancient Mesopotamians believed that everything had a soul. The river did not flow just because of gravity, but because a river god guided the water. The sun did not rise just because of astronomy, but because Shamash rode a fiery chariot. The wind did not blow just because of air pressure, but because Enlil was breathing. And so, every speck of dust, every drop of water, every gust of wind became a song. And the listeners were human beings. A lamp and an ancient question. Imagine you are a Mesopotamian from 4,000 years ago. You hold a small clay lamp, its oil burning brightly like the eye of the night. You sit amidst the reeds by the Euphrates, looking at the star-filled sky, a sky untainted by light pollution, as clear as a mirror and as deep as the sea. You would ask yourself, who lit those stars? Who guides the sun? Why are we here? The answer was not in books. It was in legends told by the fire, through the voices of village elders and priests. And each of those stories, each of those poems, was the foundation of Babylon. When dust became myth, the Babylonians did not see their gods as distant. They saw them in the river they irrigated, in the bread they baked, in the smell of the earth after rain. Therefore, they told stories of the gods as they told stories of themselves. The gods also loved, were jealous, grew angry, and knew how to laugh. The gods also built cities, kept promises, and sometimes failed. From this perspective, the gods were not just rulers of heaven and earth. They were companions to humanity. The Song of the Earth. Enuma. Elish. One of the oldest Mesopotamian songs preserved and sung by the Babylonians during the New Year festival is the Enuma Elish, When on High. The song begins not with war, but with a silent flow. When the heavens above had not been named, and the earth beneath had not been called, there was only Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the saltwater sea, embracing each other in the darkness. This song was not just to explain the universe. It was like a lullaby of earth and water, lulling humanity to sleep in the belief that everything began from love and chaos. The temple, where dust sang to the sky. When humans built the first temples, They believed each brick contained the breath of a god. The temple was not just for prayer, but for singing with the gods. During the Akitu festival, New Year celebration, Babylonian priests would sing the Enuma Elish to Marduk, as if to remind him, "We still remember the first story, and as long as we sing, you will never forget humanity." When chaos was still a breath in Mesopotamian myth, before there was earth, sky, mountains, and rivers, there was only a chaotic, nameless sea. They called it Tiamat, the goddess of the saltwater sea, endless, cold, and primordial. Along with Tiamat was Apsu, the god of fresh water, gentle but full of life. The two were entwined in an eternal embrace, creating waves of darkness and silence. Then, from the breath of these two primordial gods, the younger gods were born. Lamu and Lahamu, the first red streams, Anshar and Kishar, the horizon, and from them new generations of gods continued to emerge. But like any family, conflict arose. The noise of the young gods tired Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu, in a fit of anger, wanted to wipe out his descendants to return to the original silence. The rise of Marduk. As Apsu and Tiamat prepared to attack their offspring, a young, wise god appeared, Marduk. Marduk was not the strongest god in terms of physical power, but he was the most intelligent, skillful, and far-sighted. He proposed, "If you grant me supreme power, I will defeat Tiamat and establish eternal order." And the gods agreed. The battle with Tiamat. The image of Marduk stepping onto the battlefield is a sacred painting that the Babylonians sang of every Akitu festival. Marduk wore golden armor, carried a net of wind and a giant bow, and was followed by the four winds and the tempest. Tiamat, the embodiment of the saltwater sea, rose up, her mouth open like an abyss, full of teeth and fire. Marduk shot his arrow, splitting Tiamat in two. One half of her body became the sky. The other half became the earth. Tiamat's eyes turned into a source of ever-flowing water. From chaos, Marduk created the world as a poem. After his victory, Marduk reorganized the universe. He hung the sun, moon, and stars like lamps in the darkness. He divided day and night. He created the calendar, seasons for sowing and reaping. He carved his mark on the wind, clouds, and rivers. Everything was no longer chaotic. Everything began to have a rhythm, like a song. Humanity, the final gift. The gods were still not at peace. They needed servants to perform rituals, to praise, to care for the temples. Marduk decided to create humanity. He used the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's general, mixed with clay, to create the form of humans. Weak but intelligent, small but able to sing, and most importantly, able to remember and be grateful to the gods. Praise Marduk, for from the blood of the enemy, he created life. Enuma Elish. Marduk, the god of Babylon. Among the myriad city-states of Mesopotamia, each worshipped its own god. But Babylon chose Marduk. They saw him not only as the supreme god, but as a model of order and justice. Marduk was called Bel, the Lord. His temple, Esagila, was where the soul of the city resided. His image was inlaid on walls, printed on seals, carved into clay tablets. Every year during the Akitu festival, the priests would read the Enuma Elish to remember, "We exist because there is order." And that order was created by Marduk. The philosophical meaning of Marduk. Marduk was not just an ancient god. He was a symbol of the human will against chaos. Chaos never disappears. It always exists, like Tiamat. But each generation must split its own Tiamat, which is fear, disorder, and the unknown. The Babylonians understood this, and they sculpted the image of Marduk as a symbol that we can turn fear into order and darkness into light. The story of Marduk was told for thousands of years, not just as a religious myth, but as a lesson on the power of wisdom and courage. O humanity, if the day comes when darkness returns, remember, Marduk once lit the world from chaos itself. Ishtar, the beauty that cannot be held. If Marduk was wisdom and order, then Ishtar was the burning heart of Babylon. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility, and also the goddess of war, a living contradiction between happiness and suffering. When the Mesopotamians saw a field of ripe wheat, they believed it was Ishtar smiling. But when war broke out and blood stained the Euphrates, they also believed that Ishtar had wept with anger. Beauty and power Ishtar was described as a goddess who shone like the morning and evening star. She was compared to the planet Venus, appearing every dawn and dusk, as a reminder that the most beautiful things always come and go. It was said, "Whoever Ishtar loves will become great, but they will also suffer loss." King Gilgamesh once rejected her love, and for that, she sent the bull of heaven to punish the city of Uruk. Ishtar's love was not gentle. It was a love of fire and sword, of passion and tears. The goddess of spring and life Ishtar is associated with the story of Tammuz, her lover, a god of vegetation. When Tammuz was dragged down to the underworld, the crops withered, the land dried up. Ishtar decided to descend to the underworld to find him. She passed through the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, she had to remove a piece of jewelry, a layer of clothing, until she stood naked before the Queen of Darkness. This sacrifice made nature weep. But then Ishtar was released, bringing Tammuz back every spring so that the trees would bloom again and the fields would be green. War and love, the two faces of Ishtar. Ishtar was not just gentle love. She was also the goddess of the war drum, of soldiers going off to battle. When Babylon went to war, people prayed to Ishtar, "Grant us courage like your heart and sharpness like your sword." Ishtar's temples were often decorated with lions, symbols of strength, but alongside them were roses, symbols of life and love. The image of Ishtar in Babylonian life. The goddess Ishtar appeared on brick walls, seals, and even in work songs. Babylonian women prayed to Ishtar for blessings on their families. Soldiers prayed to Ishtar for strength. Farmers prayed to Ishtar for a bountiful harvest. To them, Ishtar was not a stranger. She was like a mother, both gentle and protective, and strict when her children went astray. Ishtar and the philosophy of fragile beauty. There is an ancient hymn dedicated to Ishtar. "You are as beautiful as the moonlight, but the moonlight will wane. You are as radiant as fire, but the fire will die out. O Ishtar, teach us to love and to let go, as you love and let go of this world." The Babylonians believed that beauty does not exist forever to be possessed. Beauty exists to be felt, to be cherished, and then to depart. Ishtar was the embodiment of that impermanence. Ishtar, with her love and tears, was not just a goddess of an era, but a symbol of what humans have always craved: to love, to be loved, and to accept the pain of love. If anyone asks why Babylon could live for thousands of years, the answer is, because this place knew how to love and how to weep with Ishtar. The teacher of the river. Also known as Enki, was the god of fresh water, wisdom, and craftsmanship. If Marduk was the general who split chaos, and Ishtar was the burning heart of life, then E was the silent, patient teacher who taught humans how to live with nature. The Babylonians believed it was Ea who taught them how to dig irrigation canals, how to use baked bricks to build dams, how to use clay to make cuneiform tablets. In ancient hymns, Ea does not appear as a warrior or a conqueror, but as a cool river that washes away human fear and fatigue. The father of humanity. In some legends, it was Ea who warned Utnapishtim, the Noah-like figure in the Epic of Gilgamesh, about the Great Flood. When the other gods decided to wipe out humanity, Ea quietly sent a message. Build a ship. Bring with you the seeds of life. When the storm passes, the world will need a new beginning. Thus, humanity did not disappear. Ea became the kind father, always protecting life from the wrath of the universe. Shamash, the light of justice. If Ea was the river, then Shamash was the sun. Every morning when the sun rose, the Babylonians believed that Shamash was riding his fiery chariot across the sky, bringing the light of justice to all places. Shamash was the god of law, truth, and oaths. His image is carved on the stele of Hammurabi's code, where he gives the rod and ring, symbols of justice, to the king. Shamash sees all. Though you hide your face in darkness, his fire will still find you. An inscription on a cuneiform tablet. The light of righteousness. The people of Babylon, whenever they had a dispute, believed that Shamash was the final judge. Before pronouncing a sentence, the priests would pray, "May Shamash illuminate our minds so that the innocent may be vindicated and the deceitful be exposed." It can be said that Shamash was the inspiration for the concept of divine justice, an idea thousands of years ahead of its time. He was not just the sun god, but the sun of righteousness in the human heart. The river and the light, the two breaths of Babylon. Without Ea and Shamash, Babylon would have no flow and no order. Ea provided water, the source of life for the crops. Shamash provided law, the source of life for society. In the minds of the Babylonians, a beautiful day was a day with water in the canals and light in the heart. Both were blessings from Ea and Shamash. The philosophy of the two gods, E taught humanity flexibility, like water, knowing how to bend but not disappear. Shamash taught humanity straightforwardness. Like the sun, though there is darkness, it always returns each morning. By combining these two, the Babylonians believed they found a balanced way of life, both flexible and upright. Conclusion of Part 4. E and Shamash were not loud gods. They were the silent foundation of everything. Like water and light, no one praises them every day, but without them, life cannot continue. The river flows, the sun rises, and in them, Ea and Shamash still watch over us. When the temples were only shadows, time did not preserve the bricks as they were on the first day. Wind, sand, and rain have worn everything away. The walls of Esagila, the blue-glazed gates of Ishtar, are now just broken fragments scattered under the Mesopotamian dust. But when we look at that pile of bricks, we can hear a distant sigh. We were once the light. The gods of Babylon did not disappear because no one believed anymore, but because people stopped calling their names. Even so, their names still hang in the wind, like fragments of a memory that was never forgotten. The silence of a civilization. After Babylon fell, no priest sang the Enuma Elish in the temple of Marduk. The fire of Ishtar no longer burned brightly. The Euphrates River still flowed, but there were no more hymns dedicated to Ea. The sun still rose, but no one prayed under the name of Shamash. The temples fell silent. But in that silence, there was another kind of music. the music of memory. When humans rediscovered the names. In the 19th century, the first archaeological expeditions from Europe and America came to Iraq. They found clay tablets with cuneiform, seals, and fragments of the Ishtar Gate. Each deciphered line was a whisper returning from 1,000 years ago. An English scholar wrote, "I feel as if I am hearing the voices of the ancient gods, not in myth, but in every stroke on the clay tablet. The gods in the modern imagination. Today, we no longer make offerings to Marduk, no longer light fires for Ishtar. But in films, novels, and research, these gods are revived as symbols. Marduk is mentioned as a model of order before chaos. Ishtar has become a symbol of female power and fierce love. Ea and Shamash are the call for wisdom and justice. We call them not to worship, but to remind ourselves humanity is the product of collective memory." And the philosophy from forgotten names. The gods of Babylon no longer exist in temples, but they exist in ideas. That chaos can be turned into order, Marduk. That love is both beautiful and painful, Ishtar. That water and justice are the foundations of life, Ea and Shamash. This is not just mythology. This is the story of humanity itself, when the wind blows through the ruins. If one day you stand before the ruins of Babylon, amidst the vast desert and dust, try to close your eyes. You will hear the footsteps of ancient priests, the laughter and tears of the people who once lived here, and the wordless song of the gods who have long since departed. The dust of Babylon is not just ruins, it is the soundtrack of memory. Though the temples are silent, the names of Marduk, Ishtar, Ea, Shamash still echo in the wind like a lullaby, reminding us. We once created this world, and in every story humanity retells, we are still here. The dream. Dissolved Babylon did not collapse in a day. It did not disappear like a snuffed-out candle. It faded, like a dream slowly dissolving into the dawn. But even as it dissolved, the dream left a phosphorescent glow in the memory of humankind. Where the ziggurat once stood tall, touching the clouds, there are now only broken tiers of brick, silent under the Mesopotamian sun. No one ascends it anymore to meet the gods. No more crowds sing in the festival of Marduk. Only the winds blowing through the cracks. As if memory is whispering to the sand. We were once the light. Babylon, the defiant child of the Tigris and Euphrates plains, learned to go from the pride of its golden age to the silence of ruins, and finally to transform into a seed in the memory of humanity. Not every civilization has that honor, the honor of being exiled in the mind of humankind with all its contradictions, both a ruler and a source of inspiration, both a place of confinement and a gateway to enlightenment. There are cities that live on blood. There are empires that live by the sword. But Babylon, after losing everything, lives on in nostalgia. It lives in the hum of scholars copying cuneiform tablets in European libraries, in the ancient star maps referenced by NASA, in the administrative language of dozens of nations, in the dream of the returning Jewish people, and in the unanswered questions about the Tower of Babel, the Hanging Gardens, and the hubris of humanity. Today, when you look up at the night sky, you may not see Babylon, but you will see the stars they once named. And if you listen long enough in the silence, perhaps somewhere in the wind passing through the ancient brick walls in Iraq, you will hear a very soft whisper. Oh, you who come after, if there ever comes a time when humanity forgets who it is, remember, we were once Babylon, and we left a light amidst the ashes.